Welcome back. I believe, are drawing close to the 100th day of the war, and that's a really grim milestone. Nevertheless, here we are. And I want to just kind of like jump back into our timeline, where from the late 80s to the present day, the chief manifestation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been with the Palestinians directly and negotiating the challenges of rising Palestinian nationalism, which is really something we talked about last time. We talked about I know we're going back several weeks now. We talked about the formation of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. We talked about the growing Palestinian national movement and the irony that in some ways Palestinian nationalism was actually taking a cue from Zionism itself, and recognizing that a national movement would be representative of the aspirations of a people, even though before the 1960s, you don't have Palestinians referring to themselves with a kind of national identity. I think that for those people who today argue, I think the most obnoxious form of the argument, obviously I'm editorializing here, is there is no Palestinian people. I think that does a great injustice to the fact that for the better part of 60 years, the Palestinians have identified as a people. So at what point do you get to say, this is a people? They identify this part of the world as their homeland. And I think that squabbles over who is more indigenous or who has the better claim to the land are at best unproductive. The Palestinians are not going to let go of their narrative, of their deeply shared sense that this is their land and they are a people, indeed a nation now without a land in which they are sovereign. That's their story. And the Jewish people are also not going to let go of our story, which is that this is our land and we are indigenous here and we have a right to govern ourselves and live in peace and be a sovereign nation. So that's very much the situation we're in. We also talked a little bit about the rise of Islamic extremism or Islamic fundamentalism, chiefly an organization with chapters throughout the Arab Muslim world called the Muslim Brotherhood. I mentioned, in fact, that in the War of Independence, what we refer to as the 1948 War, 1948-49, which began as a civil war between the Jewish and Arab populations of what was then British Mandatory Palestine, and then after the British withdrew, it grows into a regional conflict of Israel fighting Palestinian Arabs internally, as well as the armies of Arab nations surrounding Israel. During that war, Yasser Arafat fought alongside the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the most prominent Islamist group aligned with the cause of removing Zionism, or removing the Zionist entity from the Middle East. That's basically what the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations that share certain ideological commonalities with Muslim Brotherhood believe, that the Zionist entity is illegitimate and must be removed or eliminated. And that was the position of the Muslim Brotherhood going back even before the war. It grows out of some of the more extreme positions articulated within the Arab Muslim world, including both in what was then British Mandatory Palestine and in surrounding nations. The Muslim Brotherhood proves to be a durable organization. It is durable in that it not only sponsors terror and adheres to a doctrine of violent resistance against the Zionist entity, but also it filled a vacuum throughout many places in the Middle East by providing social services, healthcare, food, humanitarian assistance, and education. And all of that comes with indoctrination as well of a highly conservative, traditional Islamic religious message. So in parts of the world where the Muslim Brotherhood has had a strong influence, you see a rise of, for instance, women wearing hijab, restrictions on the role of women in the workplace, and other things that we associate with more conservative or traditional Islamic societies, be they, let's say, pre-2023 Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is undergoing a very dramatic Westernization, or at least they would not acknowledge that it's Westernization, but Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the de facto autocrat, monarch of Saudi Arabia, is very interested in making Saudi Arabia much more accepted within the West. But you also see it in the Islamic regime in Iran. Societies that are traditional often look to the women and the role of women in society if you want to know how widespread and how conservative a Muslim regime is. Look to how they treat their women. As Arafat rose to prominence, the UN, which again, we pointed out the irony of this, the UN was only a 2-year-old organization. It was established after World War II, very much was intended to both imitate the League of Nations that was Woodrow Wilson's kind of dreamed of legacy for a new global order after World War I. It was not particularly successful. So it was intended to address the failings, but in some ways modeled itself after the League of Nations. It was very much established, though, to secure stability in Europe and throughout the world in a post-World War II reality. So when Israel was established as an independent state, the United Nations was effectively only a couple of years old. And in the 60s in particular, and into the 70s and 80s, the UN becomes an increasingly receptive platform for, depending on what your point of view is, either pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel rhetoric, including Arafat's famous speech at the UN General Assembly in 1974, where he, in word, extends an olive branch to Israel, but then he dramatically pulled back his coat to reveal a machine gun in a holster, right? So it was sort of a, yeah, we'll extend an olive branch or else. And the message was not lost on Israel or on the West. In 1975, the United Nations passed General Assembly Resolution 3379, which determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. This was revoked 16 years later in 1991 at the General Assembly. This all was happening in a context where the UN had also recently granted the PLO permanent observer status, and that was following the famous or the infamous olive branch speech. And so the UN has, again, been a receptive place for anti-Israel rhetoric and the passing of resolutions. And anyone who does the math on this can track that over the last 50 years, the UN has passed resolutions condemning Israel all out of proportion to any other sovereign country in the world. It speaks for itself, in my view. I don't need to go out on a soapbox. I'm just giving you the straight facts. The numbers would suggest that the UN has its crosshairs trained on Israel in a way that it does not have its crosshairs trained on any other nation in the world. Upstart Islamist movements appealed to the majority of Palestinians who, since 1948, have been living in a situation of squalor. even though there were some signs of improving conditions for Palestinians in the 70s and 80s. A rise in per capita household income, the unemployment rate went down during this period, and still the UN agency that oversees Palestinian refugees, UNRWA, you might have UNRHWA, has permitted and in my view encouraged a situation where Palestinian refugees and their children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren, going down 4 generations since 1948, have been permitted to maintain their status as refugees and to live in these squalid refugee camps, which are often the places where extremist ideologies and violent resistance against Israel are fomented. On December 9th, 1987, so that was exactly 36 years ago and change, and a month, an Israeli truck driver accidentally ran over 4 Arab workers in the Gaza Strip. The long simmering Arab street in the West Bank, the other place that was predominantly Palestinian by population, exploded in fury and violence with masses of thousands of Palestinians, mostly young, confronting IDF soldiers, throwing rocks, and at times Molotov cocktails. The name that was given to this widespread uprising was Intifada, which is a term that means shaking off. It's a word that's come up a lot since October 7th, and often the way in which you're hearing it now is with slogans that you or your kids or grandkids might be seeing on social media or on their college campuses. Globalize the Intifada. And Intifada, again, initially means an effort to shake off what the Palestinians perceive to be the intolerable state of affairs in Gaza and the West Bank, which, as we recall from previous sessions, was territory captured by Israel in war, where the IDF had moved in, and so effectively military jurisdiction was military jurisdiction was held by Israel in Gaza and the West Bank. These are areas where the population is predominantly Palestinian, and since the late 60s, that fact has been, or the fact of the difficulty between the IDF, or Israel, and the areas of Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza has been greatly exacerbated by the religious national movement to settle population of Jews, usually Jews who track more ultra-Orthodox or very religious, very nationalistic, in the West Bank and Gaza. Most Israelis, for instance, who view themselves as secular, which is a word that Israelis comfortably use even if they have a sukkah on their roof on Sukkot or a Shabbat dinner, what it means is that they're not Orthodox. Despite the fact that I've spent most of my rabbinate trying to help Israel grow its progressive movement, when I was there's a picture from February of 1996 from the cover of the Jerusalem Post, which was then a nice glossy biweekly magazine that was published, and now it's really online only. There's a cover of the Jerusalem Post from February 8th, 96, featuring a picture of me and 3 other HUC first-year rabbinical classmates holding a Torah, and the big image was 2 of us were women wearing talit and yarmulke, and it was the headline said, the cover article was, "Reform Makes Strides." Now, at the time, the Reform movement claimed about 15,000 people in Israel who identified as Reform. Today, that number is closer to 100,000, which is significant growth, but it's really a drop in the bucket compared to 8.5 million Jewish people in Israel. And so it is not uncommon for me when I'm visiting Israel still to meet lots and lots and lots of just ordinary Israelis on the street who've never actually met a Reform Jew, let alone a Reform rabbi. They've heard about it, They're largely misinformed still. Most of their information, unfortunately, has come with the bias of the official ultra-Orthodox state rabbinate, which is empowered by the government, has been ever since Ben-Gurion. So this reform thing is new. The people who identify as progressive or even reform, who love their non-Orthodox synagogues in Israel, who think of themselves as Jewish but probably don't go to synagogue ever. They spend Yom Kippur possibly biking on the highways. That's something you can do. You can take out your bicycle and ride on the freeways because there are no cars on Yom Kippur, but it's not because the whole population's religious. Still 70% of Israelis identify this way, as secular. By and large, those folks are not the ones living in the West Bank. Right, so there are different motivations for settler establishment of population centers in the West Bank. And these, when you think of a settlement, many of these so-called settlements are very well-developed cities and towns with significant infrastructure, and in some cases, significant wealth and affluence. Some not. I mean, there's huge variation. Some settlements are effectively really nice suburbs of Jerusalem, and there's even talk that in a final, quote-unquote, final settlement with the Palestinians, those suburbs would be annexed to Israel because it is commonly recognized that they are de facto part of Israel, though not without controversy. There are other settlements which are deeply embedded in the West Bank, far from any other areas of major Jewish population, and create, I think, much more of a problem because they require all of the services of the state, and that's everything from the education system, water, electricity, all their utilities, their healthcare, their taxation, and the protection of the IDF, because these are sovereign Israeli settlements, and the population is basically exclusively Israeli citizen Jews. The problem, of course, is that to provide that everywhere where Jews reside in significant numbers, and we're talking about the better part of 500,000 Jewish Israelis living in the West Bank, none living in Gaza today. We'll get to that. We'll get to why. You can imagine the difficulty it has created. The Intifada begins, we now call it the first Intifada, in 1987. It lasts for the better part of 6 years and also amplifies already rising Muslim extremism. So the end result of the Intifada is actually you see Israel's population, even the secular left, starting to move toward the right because they are distressed by the violence that has been visited on their people, and it foments extremism within the Palestinian population. And growing Muslim extremism begins to find more receptivity within the population of the Palestinians. Even if it's not a majority, I think of the time, around 1990 or the early 90s, there was widespread Palestinian support for a two-state solution, which is where this is all heading. Nevertheless, there was also a significant population, even if it's about a quarter or a third of the population, a minority, that would not brook any compromise with the Zionists, a position informed by national/Muslim extremist views that had been taking root and growing throughout this period of conflict. In 1988, an organization is formed, to wit, called Hamas. It's an acronym, though don't ask me what it stands for today. Hamas, and you're hearing lots of different pronunciations I've noticed on the news. In Arabic, it's Hamas. Hamas, the sound is common in Arabic. In Hebrew, there is no sound, it's Hamas, which to an Israeli sounds exactly like the biblical word that means violence. It comes up for the first time in Genesis chapter 5, I believe, when the Torah is describing the problem of the world and God wants to destroy it with a great flood. This is at the beginning of the Noah story. It says, V'ha'aretz Malay Hamas. The world was filled with Hamas, which means violence. So Israelis hear the name and it sits with them in a way that's already problematic. Though that is a false cognate. It wasn't the intention of Hamas in Arabic. Hamas, in its charter, calls for the liberation of all historic Palestine from, quote, Zionist occupation from the river to the sea. That's a phrase that, of course, again, has been politicized and weaponized since October 7th, especially, and before October 7th. Hamas incorporates into its charter talking points from a notorious Tsarist Russian forgery called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which alleges that a Jewish cabal secretly controls all global politics, banking, media, etc. Some of the most notorious and notoriously difficult to extirpate anti-Semitic canards. It insists, for instance, that the Jews founded the United Nations. This is a quote from Hamas's original charter. Jews founded the United Nations and the Security Council in order to rule over the whole world, and it places blame for almost all international wars on the Jews, and calls for it calls for all Muslims to rise up and eliminate the state of Israel. Okay. People sometimes say, well, how does Hamas enjoy so much popularity? It is the view of several Arab entities and sovereign nations in the Middle East that Hamas is effectively the Muslim Brotherhood Gaza chapter. So its ideology squares very closely with it. Its roots and its founders come from Muslim Brotherhood background. That is the position, by the way, to the present day of the country of Egypt, which has a very strong anti-Hamas position. And one of the things that has vexed me since October 7th is the allocation of blame or responsibility on Israel alone for maintaining an air, sea, and land blockade of Gaza when it is in fact jointly administered with Egypt, who has been Israel's, I would say Israel's most important regional ally since 1979, when the accords, or since 1978, when Sadat signed the accord. This is stuff we talked about last month. Many of you remember the Gulf War. It was fought in the winter of 1991, first with Operation Desert Shield and then Desert Storm. A US-led coalition of 42 nations went to war against Iraq following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. At the time, Israel was basically told by the US to hold its hands and not get involved. It is one of the reasons, by the way, why the pro-Israel, American Zionist, American Jewish community laid a lot of negative responsibility at the feet of then President George H.W. Bush and felt that he was not a great ally to Israel. I think history is shedding a perhaps more moderate or even favorable light on Bush at the time. But many of us remember the agonizing images that were broadcast, and many of us who had friends and family in Israel recall Israelis sheltering in their homes and their safe rooms with gas masks and basically not being allowed to fire back or enter the war, as Scud missiles were being lobbed into Israel all the way from Iraq. The war comes, the war goes. It was a swift victory for the US-led coalition. And in October 1991, under a Likud prime minister, Yitzhak Shamir, a conference is convened in the city of Madrid in Spain. Israeli officials secretly met with Syrian, Lebanese, and Jordanian delegations. Israel was still, at the time, refusing to negotiate directly with Arafat and the PLO. Right? Arafat has been a problematic figure for Israel since the foundation of the PLO in the 60s, the infamous olive branch speech in the mid-70s, the removal, you'll recall, of Palestinian militants under Jordan, who kicked them out. They go to Lebanon. They establish camp in Lebanon and use southern Lebanon as a base for PLO-led terrorist activity, not only across the border in Israel, but internationally. That's the period that includes the massacre of the Olympians in Munich. Eventually, Israel decides this is intolerable. It goes into Lebanon in 1982. So Israel has had huge problems with the PLO, mostly for its embrace of terror, both in Israel and against Jews abroad and Israelis abroad. At the Madrid conference, Israel did allow Palestinian representatives from the West Bank and Jordan who were not officially aligned with the PLO to join the Jordanian delegation. And remember, most of the Arabs living in Jordan, like up to as much as 70% of Arabs living in Jordan since 1948 are Palestinians. That's where their families are from. And for a time, Jordan had actually captured and governed the territory that Israel would then capture back in the 1967 Six-Day War. The Madrid Conference begins in October 1991. The idea was not to produce a peace deal, but rather to kickstart some kind of bilateral negotiation between Israel and its historic Arab neighbor enemies. Starting in 1993, following the thawing of tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors at the Madrid conference, Israel repealed a law that forbade its citizens and its government from negotiating directly with the PLO. So quietly, behind the scenes in the early 90s, the stage is being set for a very different approach to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And again, we're getting into a part of history which, although more than 30 years old, is stuff that almost everyone in this room except for two, were around for. And I think if you were paying attention at the time, can remember. So, and myself, by the way, I'm jarring my own memory. So 1991, just for reference, the year I graduated high school. 1993, I was a sophomore, junior in college. And 1995, another important year in the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, was the year I graduated college and entered rabbinical school. So my journey to Jewish leadership intersects with this period of history in a really powerful way and has been formative of my identity as a Jewish leader and as a person. Back-channel negotiations began secretly in 1993 in the city of Oslo, Norway, not Sweden, I learned from last time, resulting in all parties agreeing on a basic framework for a future two-state solution, Palestinian state alongside an Israeli Jewish state, the framework called Oslo I, Roman numeral I, the first of the two Oslo Accords. It outlined, Oslo I, a 5-year plan to negotiate with the intention of producing a permanent settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. It provided for the creation of an entity whose name is very important now, you're hearing a lot about it in the news, called the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, which would administer all territory under Palestinian control. So the idea was that Oslo created this would create an internationally recognized entity, the Palestinian Authority, which would, in time, be given the ability to transition into the responsibility of governing the Palestinian people. It provided as well that Israeli forces would pull back from portions of Gaza and the West Bank. It was signed by Shimon Peres, and who was, again, all of this was happening in secret, though there was a play on Broadway that ran for a while called Oslo. It was 3 hours. It was a commitment. I went to a matinee because I can't do like a 3-hour show at night. I had an opportunity last year to see Leopoldstadt. My only condition, Kelly said, hey, we can get discount tickets to Leopoldstadt. Every time Kelly and I go to a Broadway show, even if we pay full price, it's a tax write-off because my wife is a professional actor. So that's our excuse. It's called professional viewing. So she said, I can get us tickets to Leopoldstadt. We were going to take my parents for Father's Day last spring because it ran until early July. And I said, my only condition is not an evening. I can't do it. I said, so we saw a matinee. Oslo was also a 3-hour marathon, but I thought it was brilliant. It was written by a Westchester kid, and now I'm blanking on his name. Nice Jewish boy from Westchester. I should talk to him again. He lives in Hastings with his family. Some of you may know him. He has a connection to some of our congregants. I met him at the time, and we were going to do some program, and I think it just didn't happen. Okay. As part of the mutual recognition agreement provided under Oslo I, the PLO was called upon to recognize the State of Israel and pledge to forswear violence. So that was the condition placed on the PLO, that we're no longer going to perpetrate violence, we're going to renounce terror, and we're going to make peace. I know that hindsight being 2020, now, but also even at the time, it is easy to view what the PLO was saying as just lip service. I will say that I'm not convinced it was just lip service, though I have a deep and abiding distrust for Yasser Arafat and the PLO, especially after what unfolded in the years following Oslo. It's hard to know at the time whether or not he/they really meant it. And the only reason I say it's hard to know is because there had been other examples of negotiated peace, and as is often we need to remind ourselves, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And so even though I never expected that there would be loving embraces between the leadership of Egypt and Israel in the late 70s, nevertheless, they found a way to peace. And in 1994, during all of this Oslo development, Israel and Jordan also signed a peace treaty. And it has held for now 30 years. So these are not things to just look the other way at and say, they never meant it. Well, at least in the region, at least among other sovereign Arab state actors, we've seen proof of concept, right? We've seen that Israel and its Arab neighbors can make peace and that peace can hold. There's been peace between Israel and Egypt for more than 40 years. There's been peace between Israel and Jordan for going on 30 years. The northern border is a mess because Syria and Lebanon don't really exist, except as proxies for Iranian, and Iran and its desires to be the regional hegemonic power and the seat of the Shia Muslim world to the northeast. And Lebanon is a complete balagan, as we say in Hebrew, complete chaos. 30 years ago, this past September, a famous handshake took place on the White House lawn with President Bill Clinton presiding between Yitzhak Rabin and the chairman of the PLO, Yasser Arafat. It is, again, often pointed out, many Israelis were supportive of this. Many Israelis, like masses of Israelis, had been demonstrating and supporting the move for peace. They were tired of bloodshed. They were tired of sending their kids into battle. They were tired of terror, and they really were willing to find a different way. And again, a significant percentage, possibly a small majority of the Palestinian street was also supportive. I know, again, it is easy with hindsight and through a cynical lens to say, we never should have Yitzhak Rabin never should have shook Arafat's hand. He had blood on his hands. That's often the phrase that's used to describe Arafat. It is also true that Palestinians believed that Yitzhak Rabin, having been, the most senior military person in Israel for decades, also had blood on his hands. I'm not saying one is right or wrong. I'm just saying, remember what I've tried to emphasize, which is that this is really a conflict of stories. And those are two very different perspectives that have never really been successfully brought into harmonization with each other. A second agreement called Oslo II followed in September of '95, which took the administration of the West Bank into a more specific direction. So it provided that the Palestinians would begin to train and develop their own police forces. I'm going to share an image with you that's really interesting. Not its own military, but its own security forces. And it proposed dividing the West Bank into 3 areas, which, by the way, still hold today. So the West Bank is presently divided and has been for the last almost 30 years into Area A, which is controlled entirely by Palestinians. Area B, which is jointly administered by an Israeli and Palestinian authority. The Israeli military and Palestinians have, or the PA, the Palestinian Authority, has civil jurisdiction in Area B. And then there's Area C, which in terms of mass of land and population is actually the smallest, is controlled by the Israelis both militarily and civil. So Israel administers both military and civil jurisdiction in Area C, jointly administered Israeli military, Palestinian civil jurisdiction in Area B, all Palestinian in Area A. One problem with this is that if you look at a map of where is A, where is B, and where is C, it's not in any way contiguous. It's much more like a Swiss cheese. So if you're a family living in Nablus, which is in the northern part of the West Bank, and you have family in Bethlehem, which is south of Jerusalem, you can't just freely travel from your home down to Bethlehem without passing through A, B, and C, often multiple times. And each time you pass through an area, if you're going from an area that is controlled by basically the Palestinian Authority into an area that's controlled by the Israeli military, you're going to pass through a checkpoint, not a border crossing. I use the word, often the word checkpoint is used to describe the places where Palestinian day laborers go into Israel to work, because many, tens of thousands of Palestinians, certainly more pre-October 7th, but even today, every single working day of their lives, cross the green line, by the way, called the green line just because that's the color they used when they drew the maps. It's not actually like, some people expect like, wait a minute, I didn't see the green line. Yeah, you're over the green line. It's not actually a green line on the ground. Many Palestinians cross the green line through what is properly called a border crossing. However, it's a security apparatus of the State of Israel. I've been to a number of these. It is not a comfortable place for me as an American Jew who cares deeply about the State of Israel and who also believes in a two-state solution to be. I also believe that the security situation has warranted very careful inspection of anyone who's crossing from the West Bank into Israel. And so basically it's like, it is a large barrier, usually mostly fence, but with parts that are concrete, and then a large like staging area where Palestinian workers who are basically asked not to carry bags and large personal belongings, but can bring their lunch in a little lunch bag. They line up in the morning, often 4:30, 5 a.m., depending on what kind of work they do. Many work in construction, some work in hospitality. A number of people who are serving you your nice breakfast and Turkish coffee in your fancy Jerusalem hotels are actually East Jerusalem Palestinian Arabs. Like, it's a very complicated situation. And the folks you see across the street who are working construction on the new luxury hotels, many of those day laborers are Palestinians and they live in the West Bank. And so they come over every morning and they pass through kind of like a snaking corridor, and then there's a metal catwalk above where there will be a few IDF soldiers. There are also international human rights observers, including also Israeli human rights observers, who are there with the cooperation of the IDF to observe that the people who are coming through are not mistreated or abused. Again, the counter-argument is that it's humiliating to do this and to be subjected to even just the time it takes to get through. On a good day, you're standing in line for 45 minutes, on a good day. And often it's much more than that. And that's each direction, twice a day, on foot, getting in and out. Plus, every time Palestinians who have driver's license and cars, they have different colored license plates. So even just the logistics of going back and forth and ensuring that some Palestinians can work in Israel, you would ask yourself, well, why would a Palestinian ever want to work in Israel given this? The answer is much better wages, much better workplace treatment too. So, I have very mixed feelings when I think, people get all up in arms about the fact that Ben & Jerry's sells its products in the West Bank and they're going to close it down. And every time they do something like that, or SodaStream, I have a SodaStream. I love my SodaStream. It's just it's a little home seltzer machine. It's awesome. So if you like seltzer, it's great. And it's Israeli. But the knock against SodaStream is that its main plant has been in the West Bank. It's over the Green Line. And the counter-argument is that, but thousands of Palestinians have good jobs because of that. And they get better paid, and they get better treatment, and better workplace protections. But those who oppose the presence of Israel in the West Bank altogether have used SodaStream as one of their targets, right? It's very complicated. Meanwhile, between 1993 and 1995, all is not going well on the road to implementing Oslo. Because even as these peace negotiations were taking place, and again, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say in good faith by and large. I think at least among the negotiating parties, both Muslim and Jewish extremists had actively been working to undermine the nascent Oslo Accords. So Hamas and other jihadist groups like Islamic Jihad began carrying out suicide bombings in the mid-90s, which Arafat only rarely publicly denounced. Or when he did, he often said one thing to the international English-speaking audience and something completely different to his base in the Arabic language. Also, we have some truly disturbing examples of Jewish terrorism. In 1994, a Jewish extremist named Baruch Goldstein in Hebron murdered 29 Palestinian Muslims in prayer. In what he would have called, again, a reprisal, but it was a murderous attack on Purim intended, I think in large measure, to derail the peace negotiations. The IDF began to withdraw from Jericho and most of the Gaza Strip starting in 1994. And as I said, at that time, and that's adjacent to Jordan, and that helped pave the way between Israel's peace agreement with Jordan in 1994, in October. That was all West Bank. Right. So Gaza is still a place where there had been about 8,000 plus Jewish settlers living in Gaza at the time. And that would be the case until Gaza's Jewish settlements are dismantled a decade and more later. On November 4th, 1995, well, I was a rabbinical student. I had moved to Israel in July of 1995, or June of 1995. I graduated college. 2.5 weeks later, I was on a plane to Israel. I have very few regrets in my life. One of them is that I should have taken a little bit more time before graduating college and going straight to a 5-year graduate program. But I don't know what I would have done with myself for a whole year, but it was pretty stressful to find myself like uprooted from this very placid New England small college campus and then in Jerusalem in July of 1995. It was also a very heady, a very exciting time to be there. I think at least for us Reform Jews, Reform American Jews, we were very much into the promise of the Oslo Accords and really went to Israel believing that peace with the Palestinians was very close at hand because we'd been working on it for 2 years and we really saw that that's the way things were going. Most of us were strongly supportive of Prime Minister Rabin, believed that he was the right person to carry this out. There were a few disturbing things that I noticed and that Israel noticed in the weeks leading up to November 4th, 1995. Right outside my apartment, if you went out onto the terrace, in late October 95, a Likud rally was held. So this was a rally in support of Rabin's chief opposition leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was this prominent but rising star in the Likud, the right-of-center Israeli political world. And I remember one of the images that was particularly disturbing from that rally, which was a giant effigy of Yitzhak Rabin dressed in full Gestapo garb, with blood and the Hebrew word Nazi. And this, of course, was a Jewish rally, but the willingness to go there, even in Israel, which is known for its no-holds-barred, pull-no-punches approach to civic discourse, was upsetting to me and a number of my classmates. And I guess we didn't really think much of it because we're like, whoa, like there was so much culture shock living in Israel for the first time for me. I had just turned 22 as a kid, and I was like, oh, what the hell is this? I'm like, this is really crazy. It was not the stuff that we expected to see. It was not being reported much in the Western press, but it was all over Israel. Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Rabin's widow. It was? Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know. I wasn't living here. Yeah. Okay. Good. All I know is that in hindsight, I realized that the year was difficult for me, but I think it was harder for my parents. It was a very hard year for, yeah. On November 4th, Rabin was speaking at a peace rally, recognizing that the peace process was on somewhat shaky ground and he needed to show the Jewish people, the people of Israel, that this was the way, that peace was going to create a different trajectory for Israel. And so he spoke at this rally, and it was a huge, crowded gathering in Kikar Malchei Yisrael, the square of the kings of Israel, which is the former name of what is now Kikar Rabin, Rabin Square in Tel Aviv. And there was singing, and I had classmates who were at that rally. It was a Saturday night, and I was with a bunch of my classmates in one of our apartments, just playing like word games and listening to Israeli music and just having like a Havdalah nice thing at around 9:30, 10 at night. Went back to my apartment. My girlfriend, who was a classmate of mine, called me and said, turn on the radio. I didn't have a TV. And I was trying to use my pretty rusty Hebrew skills to figure out what was happening. They were explaining that the prime minister had been shot and was taken to Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv to be treated. And I think within an hour, we knew that he had been assassinated. He had died. And the weirdest thing was that I got the call from my parents first. My parents found out first on CNN. And again, in 1995, that was weird to me. It was weird that that my parents halfway across the world knew something about literally something that had happened 45 minutes from where I was sitting before I did. Nowadays, we take it for granted that we're this globally interconnected society, but this was 30 years ago. 24/7 news was relatively new. So my parents had been watching CNN. They said, honey, we just found out that, we just heard that the prime minister has been assassinated. And I said, what? I turned the radio back on, and that's what they were announcing. Very strange. I went to visit the prime minister lying in state in his casket, draped in an Israeli black cloth and an Israeli flag, on the front plaza of the Knesset, with about 2 million Israelis over the next 2 days passed in front of his casket. I actually placed my hand on it. I watched the funeral procession from my apartment. I did not go to the funeral. Some of my classmates tried to, but it was just traffic. But I did see Clinton's motorcade and all of the delegations from world leadership. It was pretty quickly identified that the murder had been carried out by a young ultra-Orthodox Jew named Yigal Amir, who fired, I believe, 3 bullets into the back of the prime minister at almost point-blank range, was quickly apprehended, and remains to this day behind bars. Since incarcerated, because Israel does not have the death penalty, it has officially executed only one criminal, the Nazi Adolf Eichmann. And even that prompted great soul-searching among the Israeli people. So Israel does not have a legal, at least outside of its military jurisdiction, where there's a lot of stuff that's in a black box, Israel officially does not execute criminals under civil jurisprudence. I think that this was a moment of agonizing soul-searching for Israelis and for world Jewry, because at first, the first thought that, of course, crossed all of our minds is some Arab terrorist, some Palestinian extremist murdered our prime minister. And we very quickly found out, no, it was, as it were, one of our own. And I think that for some, there was an effort to disavow this isn't really Judaism. But the fact of the matter is, I've always maintained, I've preached about this, is that no, it's a particularly ugly strain of Judaism that exists, and it motivated Baruch Goldstein the year before, a year and a half before, and it motivated Yigal Amir. And by the way, he continues still to enjoy support and even the belief of a significant number of Israelis that he is a national hero. The halachic or Jewish legal reasoning that was used in the yeshivas where he and people like him might have learned from their rabbis and teachers, was that Rabin constituted an existential threat to the Jewish people and the Jewish state, and that Jewish law permits neutralizing a threat like that. It's a law called the Rodef. It has to do with if a person is pursuing you with intent to kill, you as a bystander are authorized under Jewish law to neutralize the would-be killer. We can get into that. I've taught this in my Talmud class this fall, and I think some of those lessons are actually on my YouTube channel if you want to see them. I'm going to read to you some words that Rabin spoke at that rally on November 4th, 95. He said, "I was a military man for 27 years. I fought as long as there was no chance for peace. I believe that there is now a chance for peace, a great chance. We must take advantage of it for the sake of those standing here and for those who are not here, and they are many. I have always believed that the majority of the people want peace and are ready to take risks for peace. In coming here today, you demonstrate, together with many others who did not come, that the people truly desire peace and oppose violence. Violence erodes the basis of Israeli democracy. It must be condemned and isolated. This is not the way of the state of Israel. In a democracy, there can be differences, but the final decision will be taken in democratic elections, as the 1992 elections, which gave us the mandate to do what we are doing, to continue on this course." That was Rabin at the rally before he was shot. My own view is that the peace process never really recovered from this. Amir did a lot more than murder the prime minister that day. I think he murdered the peace process in many ways. There's still argument. On October 6th, I think a majority of Israelis and people who care about the region were, including myself, were ready to say that at best the peace process, the two-state peace process, was on life support, and at worst it was long since dead. There's some very interesting conversation about a post-October 7th, post-war possibility to renew a negotiated two-state solution, but I have my doubts. I have my doubts that I certainly don't have any doubts it will not be easy, and I do not know if it will be possible. I do not know if Israel will be able to constitute a government with a mandate from the people that wants to make peace with the Palestinians after October 7th, and Israel is a democracy. I'm not sure the people will want to take those risks. And I really don't believe or know if the Palestinian people have any desire to negotiate a two-state solution. What I am really concerned about post-October 7th is that the dominant position on October 6th is even more dominant now in the Palestinian street, which is that the problem is the existence of the state of Israel itself. That's my biggest worry. That's the thing that keeps me up at night. And I'm not convinced that the 100 days since October 7th have gotten us any closer to Palestinians saying, yes, we desire to live side by side with the Zionists. If that was ever a position that the majority of Palestinians could have gotten behind, I truly believe it is not the position that they're going to get behind now or after the war ends. Michelle. Right. It's a, right. No, again, I think that you've noted a few important things on that last point. What we've not seen since October 7th, and I've said this before, is a popular uprising of Palestinian Israelis. That is a real term. We used to call them Arab Israelis, but by their own desire, they identify as Palestinian Israelis. These are people who are largely Muslim, not exclusively, but mostly Muslim, like 97% Muslim, 3% Christian or other. Arab, which is generally a linguistic or an ethno-linguistic designation, literally people who come from the Arabian Peninsula originally, but generally it refers to people in the region who speak Arabic as their first language, who are Palestinian as their national affiliation. They believe that they are part of the Palestinian people and would-be state. And many of them have Israeli citizenship, to the tune of close to 20%. 1 in 5 Israelis is not a Jewish Israeli. They are Palestinian Israelis. They are largely Muslim Palestinians who live in Israel. They carry Israeli passports. They go to Israeli schools, though not the same schools as Jewish kids go to. They do not, by and large, fight in the IDF, though some do. It's really complicated. But yes, I believe that a majority of Palestinian Israelis are not actively getting involved in this war on one side or the other. Meir Kahana, I believe, may his name be stamped out, was an influential teacher who, among other things, called for the forcible removal of Palestinians from all of the territory, including West Bank and Gaza, relocating them to places like Jordan and Lebanon, which have, not been foreign to Palestinian refugees, and preached a message that led followers to commit acts of violence against Arabs in the name of Judaism. Having said that, some of what Kahana was actually saying does track with what I've just said, that the belief at the time in the 80s and 90s was that the Palestinians are not interested in two states for two peoples. It's very hard to say what is and what isn't, also because it's been an evolving situation. Many more Israelis in the 80s and 90s, especially the early 90s, were willing to go to the mat and show up at a peace rally in Tel Aviv arguing two states for two peoples, who would not today. They really are disillusioned, particularly after the second intifada, which we're getting to. I'm going to hold off on your other follow-up questions so that we can get a little bit farther. Here's what's happened since Peres, and then I'll take Julie's question as well, since Rabin's assassination. Peres steps in as interim prime minister. He was the number 2 in the Labor Party, which was the left of center party from which Yitzhak Rabin was the head of the governing coalition at the time. Peres steps in, I remember this well, and calls for elections, I believe, twice. They end up being at the end of May. I know this because the election was held the day I returned to the US. So it was Memorial Day weekend here in the States. It was like May 27th, 1996. Thinking that would be his best shot at winning and underestimating the strength of support for Bibi and Likud. The end result actually is that Netanyahu takes the prime ministership for the first time. It was also the first and only time, either before or since, that Israel held direct elections of its prime minister. As opposed to voting by party, you voted that one time by person, which also, in hindsight, at least if you were in the Peres-Rabin camp, turned out to be a strategic error. Peres loses the election to Netanyahu. Netanyahu is able to forge a Likud-led coalition. The IDF withdrew, by the way. So even after Rabin was shot, motion continues in the direction of the Oslo Accords, which had outlined this framework. So the IDF withdrew from most major cities in the West Bank except for Hebron, which is often held up as sort of like the bad child of Israeli-Palestinian relations. Hebron is, to this day, still a mess. But it is not indicative of the life of ordinary Palestinians in every other place in the West Bank. So I get a little bit vexed when I see Hebron held up as the picture of the occupation. Like, no, that's what it looks like in Hebron It is definitely not what it looks like in Ramallah, right? It is not. So if you're just seeing pictures of Hebron, that is not the condition in the majority of the West Bank. The PA takes over after elections. Arafat and his Fatah party win, and statehood for the Palestinians seems to be moving forward. At the same time, extremists seeking to undermine the process undertake significantly more violent and disruptive tactics to do so. So the fall of my first year of rabbinical school was marked by the assassination of Rabin and the awful, agonizing soul-searching that followed. The winter and spring were marked by waves of Palestinian suicide bombings on public transportation, buses in particular, and some cafes and public streets. I believe that I lived through 6 bombings within a 3-mile radius of my apartment. Our class was pretty rattled. To the credit of our class and its teachers and the leadership of the Hebrew Union College, we were encouraged to stay and not go home. 3 years earlier, the class of rabbinical students, we all spend our first year in Israel and then 4 years stateside. So I went to Cincinnati after my year in Israel and did completed my graduate studies there. The class of 1992 actually split down the middle after the Gulf War, with half of the students going home and half staying there. And it was pretty bad. To this day, there are still rabbis who don't talk to each other because they so dislike and devalue the decision that some of their classmates made. So our class resolved, not in a formal covenant or pact, but we resolved that we would stay. And I think that some of us, against significant parental pressure. My parents were pretty good, but some of it was that it cost $400, $500 a month just to speak to my parents for an hour a week. This was before WhatsApp. We would have a once-a-week, hour-long phone call, and I only later realized what my folks were shelling out for that, which is nuts. So some of it is that they didn't really know the day-to-day of what I and my classmates were going through. I didn't have email. I mean, I did, but I had to go to the library to use it with one of those green and black screen computers. Like, it was just crazy, but okay, 1995, it wasn't that long ago. So Hamas-led and Islamic Jihad-led suicide bombings take place throughout the winter and spring of 96. Netanyahu is elected in 96 and does what he can at the time to stall or even reverse the implementation of Oslo. And that was the position on which he was elected. It was like, this is not the way, we're going to find a way out. But remember, there had been very significant motion for years now in this direction. So it wasn't like he could just say, we're out, which would have probably prompted even more violence. Not exactly clear to me why he wasn't able to hold the position of prime minister for longer than a couple of years, but in 1999, a highly decorated soldier named Ehud Barak, governing through labor, won the next election on a peace platform, which really says to me that still a majority of Israelis believed that this was possible. But you can see there's a huge split in Israeli society then, and I think even now, about this issue. We see an increasingly belligerent Hezbollah, the Shia Islamic extremist group that also provides all kinds of social services and is the de facto governing authority in southern Lebanon, becoming increasingly belligerent with rocket fire into Israel. As a result, Barak actually withdrew all IDF forces from Lebanon in May of 2000, and he comes to office with a renewed determination to achieve peace with the Palestinians. That's his platform. So in the summer of 2000, he convenes with Clinton and Arafat at Camp David, and they put on the table all the issues that had stymied peace up until then. 1, what will be the borders of the Palestinian state? 2, what will be the status of Jerusalem when all is said and done? 3, what will be the status of Jewish settlements in Gaza and the West Bank? And 4, what to do about the Palestinians' stated desire to implement a right of return, meaning that all refugees and all of their descendants could return to their homes in Israel. it's one of the many sticking points that has never been resolved, or at least not in favor of the Palestinians. Israel has basically flat out refused every single time. We will not talk about a right of return. It was first raised by Sadat in proposing a negotiated peace between Egypt and Israel, and Begin said, absolutely not. We're not even touching the Palestinians. And that's when I said to you the last time we met, basically Sadat and Begin agree to sell out the Palestinians in order to achieve what they wanted for their own security. Now, Julie.
I think you're getting that there was a real plan then that came out of this.
Yes.
Was actually pretty decent,
Right.
including a big, like a right of return.
Yeah, compensation to the refugees was proposed in lieu of actually letting them actually return.
There was a very serious plan.
Correct. Right, and as well as the idea was that if you're a refugee or descendant of a refugee in Lebanon, in Tunisia, in Jordan, you can come back to what will be Palestine, a Palestinian state in most of the West Bank, offering somewhere in the order of about 92% of the territory of the West Bank and Gaza, without a great figuring out of how to connect these two territories and allow for the safe travel between them for Palestinian families. Take Michelle, and then I'll take Michelle.
I just wanted to say that in context of what was happening in the rest of the world, there was the Puerto Rican liberation group that was blowing up stuff. There was the Irish. There was apartheid. All of these things. So Israel was the last one that wasn't resolved.
Right, and I think that for many people who were watching the world stage, the resolution of the long simmering problems in places like Ireland, Northern Ireland, apartheid South Africa, provided a hopeful template that Israel-Palestine might go in a similar direction. And even now, by the way, I think the case that is most often used among we'll call it the peace camp today, is it worked in Northern Ireland. Correct. Right, I got a question. Right, yeah, and correct. So two things on that. One, which is why Northern Ireland is the favored comparison. Two, I've gotten a number of questions about what the hell is South Africa doing getting involved in today's conflict. And one of the unfortunate, I would say, that's an editorial comment. I try to not put too many of those in my teaching, but I believe it is an unfortunate development that the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians has been so awash in racial overtones and allegations, particularly when a majority of Israelis do not see themselves as white and are not European. So the idea that Israel is a white oppressor state oppressing a minority black or black-brown population is obnoxious to me only because it's divorced from fact. But it makes a compelling narrative. It certainly plays into I think the kind of debased interpretation of intersectional theory, which suggests that when looking at the condition of different groups, different minority groups in particular, you have to consider the intersecting layers of oppression. So a black person has systemically been disadvantaged in American society from the very beginning. And that goes all the way, even well past Jim Crow. Just like, why is it that black people have a harder time getting ahead? It isn't really predominantly about their behaviors or habits. It's about centuries of enforced or encoded racism structurally. And if you happen to be a woman who is black, then you've got all of that plus all of the ways in which women are kept down in our society. And if you happen to be a woman who is black, who is queer, right, and a woman who is black, who is queer, who is trans, right, the likelihood of violence against you or suicide is so high. So this is the way in which intersectional theory should work. But unfortunately, if you're not deeply versed in the theory and you just look at this on the ground, you can make assumptions about the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that sound very compelling. The only problem with them is they're just not true. They're just not true. I've met many, many Jews from Ethiopia and Yemen who look black to me. And by the way, who are oppressed and who deal with structural racism in Israeli society. By the way, there's a thing in Israel which is called driving while Arab. Remember how I said a few minutes ago there are, a few million Arab Israeli citizens, Palestinian Arabs? They are far more likely to be stopped by Israeli police. Not whether or not the police are white, that's not the issue. As are Ethiopians, as are Yemenite Jews, as are Jews from Morocco. Skin color factors in, but it isn't the case that a mass of white European Jews are systematically oppressing a population of color on the West Bank. By and large, to my eye, Palestinians and Israelis look the same. They look the same. Yeah.
Also, Dan Senor has this great podcast, right? So he interviewed Rabbi Volpe.
Yep, David Wolpe.
One of the things he talked about making it so ridiculous is that if you go back in centuries upon centuries upon centuries, Jews were oppressed and kicked out. Right. So it's
Right. The problem is, one, generally Jews don't wear their oppression in the color of their skin, so we can pass. Two, nowadays, Israel does not look like an oppressed people or country. Does not look. And so, this is the problem with, getting your history from TikTok and Instagram. And I was listening to a totally unrelated podcast this morning that used one of my favorite terms, which is Occam's razor. I think this is a theory proposed in the 18th century. It's an Enlightenment idea that in seeking the best explanation for any phenomenon observable in nature, the simplest explanation is usually the best. I talk about Occam's razor all the time, right? You don't want to invent elaborate Byzantine theories for why things are the way they are when there's an explanation staring you in the face. The problem with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I truly believe, is that the simplest explanation is usually the worst. The simplest explanation for why Palestinian lives are so much more miserable than most Israeli lives on most measures: infant mortality, education, per capita income, health, longevity, all of these things, right? All of the things that we use to evaluate how well is a people or a nation doing is so much worse. Well, it just looks so easy, right? White oppressor country, settler colonialism, genocide, apartheid, right? And oppressed people of color. The problem is that is not the explanation. And then if I want to explain it to somebody, I'm like, do you have 6 weeks to come to WRT on Sunday mornings? Okay. Yeah, Michelle. Well, yeah, Israel. And this is part of the reason the Palestinians make their argument, right? Because Israel, by law, this was established by Ben-Gurion, made a very, very open standard, right? It was if you have one Jewish grandparent, the same standard that Hitler's Nazis used to send you to the camps, right? That would be the standard by which a person's petition for citizenship under right of return would be accepted. One of the things that the October 6th and previous right-wing coalition was arguing among the judicial overhaul, one of the lesser points, but it's still very worrisome to someone like me, is narrowing the criteria for the right of return so that you have to be more Jewish, as it were, to claim citizenship under the right of return, which I think is bad for Israel. I think Israel's success in large measure has been its openness to people like Jews whose historical origins really were kind of unknown to the majority of the world's Jews, like the Jews of Ethiopia and the Jews of Uganda. And even the Jews of the Soviet Union, whose Jewish identity had been effectively erased by the Soviets for 3 generations. So Israel's willingness to take these people back and say, no, this is still your home because you are a Jew, is exactly the model that the Palestinians use in their talking points to say, well, you have this, why can't we? As a part of a putative, correct. No, the right of return, There's no historical precedent for a Palestinian right of return except that it is perennially a talking point. And by the way, will be again. We haven't gotten rid of this challenge. Yeah, Steve and then Ruth.
Yeah, there's two things. The problem is, I think, on the Arab-Palestinian side, there's no incentive for them to make it. What's the incentive? They keep getting funded, they keep getting sympathy. And for the Arabs, if you look at the long, if you're playing the long game, we outnumber these guys, I don't know, what is it, thousands?
The Arab mindset is right.
So if you take the whole, it's always, it's like Israel versus Palestine, but really it's Israel versus the Arab Muslim world.
Right.
Is really the conflict.
Yes, and playing the long game is a deeply embedded strategy in Muslim history.
So what's you need to incentivize it. I mean, so I don't want to, take a really crude example. The Japanese had to be incentivized to surrender with atomic weapons, and their cities being turned to charcoal. I mean, that's brutal
Right.
and horrible.
Right.
That was the only way to incentivize them to surrender.
Right.
And even then, some of the generals, you needed two bombs, even after the first one. Right.
Right.
There were still generals who said that's a bad idea and committed to prove. Okay, so even then there were some who said even after that we
Right.
shouldn't surrender.
Though, save for a few very, very extreme voices, nobody, even in the Israeli right, is actually calling for all-out war.
No, but I'm just saying, on the other side, there's no incentive.
Correct.
So you need to incentivize them, one, by saying, somebody has to say to them, you lost.
Right.
You lost this war of
Well, I think that was...
Israel's here to stay has to be the first message.
Right.
And they have to accept that.
But no Palestinian leader has accepted that premise. So getting back to what Barack offered under Clinton at Camp David in 2000, the Palestinian negotiation team turned it down out of hand. They didn't even sit at the table for this.
So they need to be incentivized, and nobody
I agree.
asks what is the compromise that they have to make.
Right. You're right.
Of course, they're compromising. We're compromising by letting Israel exist.
Give me a few minutes to take Ruth's question, and yeah.
I was just going to make the same comment, which is just the sheer number of them. When you see
Yeah.
Gaza in the street, it's gazillions of boys and men. What are they all going to do if they can't, there's nothing else for them to do? So they are
Right. I do believe that a very significant percentage of the Palestinian street is wedded to a narrative that calls for the elimination of the state of Israel and that requires a condition of perpetual victimhood for their national identity. And they have not been able to break out of that. Now, by the way, there are a number of I think, Jews on the extreme end who similarly are wedded to a maximalist position of brooking no compromise, no surrender. And we saw that after the dismantling of the Gaza settlements in 2005. So let me just skim through a little bit so that I complete my requirement here. Arafat, for his part, viewed it as an advantage to walk away, because what he could then say to his people is he stood up to the Zionists. And this is a playbook that he has had deployed before. 92% of the West Bank and parts of Jerusalem, as well as dismantling of Jewish settlements, for the most part, the annexing of certain settlements close to Jerusalem, which were basically suburbs, no right of return. But 92% of the West Bank. And compensation for refugees. Camp David 2000. Territorial swaps. Exactly. They said, right, that's right. That's right. David?
Isn't it true that part of the theory there that Arafat was scared, as you alluded to last time, of getting himself killed?
I believe that's always been the case.
The irony, of course, is that he got cancer like soon thereafter.
He did. He did. He did. And there are a lot of ironies to this, but I also think it's not just that he was afraid of his own safety. You remember that after signing the accords with Israel, Sadat from Egypt refused to even show up at the Nobel Awards ceremony because he was afraid of getting assassinated, which he was 2 or 3 years later. So for Arafat, I think it was also his legacy. right? Even with, I don't know when the cancer diagnosis happened, but I think he was looking at how is he going to go down in history? And he would never accept the idea that he would be the guy who sold away the Palestinian dream of all of the land between the river and the sea. I mean, he may not have said that, but I think that the evidence, here's Occam's razor. I think the simplest explanation includes that. Okay. 2 months later, the talks had collapsed. It's the summer of 2000. Now it's late September 2000. And Defense Minister Ariel Sharon decides now's a great time to visit the Temple Mount, accompanied by a few hundred Israeli police, which enraged the Palestinians, and they assembled a protest of more than 20,000 people who stormed the mount. Israeli forces responded with water cannon, with rubber bullets, and with small firearms, which escalated the riots. A result of which 7 Palestinian rioters are killed, 300 Palestinians wounded, 70 Israeli police also wounded. The Palestinian leadership calls for a jihad against the Jewish people and the Jewish state. And although we didn't know it, at that very moment, a second intifada had begun. Less of a mass revolt than the first, but far more lethal, especially because of the widespread use of suicide bombing as a tactic. Clinton tries one last-ditch effort to resuscitate the peace process. So, and I believe, when was he voted out of office? He was out, right? He was already a lame duck. Right. So he had already served his 8 years from 92 to 2000. Yeah, so December. Right, Bush versus, right. So Gore had been finally elected. Yeah, okay. Right, they were hanging, I remember hanging chads. Okay, so Bush was supposed to take office in January of 21. It's December of 2000, and really his last thing in office was Clinton proposes the so-called Clinton parameters. Here's what he put on the table. The Palestinians will get somewhere between 94 and 96% of the West Bank territory. He did not mention Gaza at all, but his team clarified that the Gaza Strip would be part of a future Palestinian state. He proposed dismantling the settlements in isolated areas while incorporating the settlements situated in substantial blocks of Jewish population, like East Jerusalem, or outside Jerusalem, rather. He proposed dividing East Jerusalem into a Palestinian and Israeli areas separately. And he proposed that Palestinian refugees would return to Palestine, not to Israel proper. And technically, here's what's really interesting. Both Israel's government at the time and the PA technically agreed to the parameters. Arafat said he had reservations and decided not to move to implement them, but he never said, I reject this. Just before Clinton left office, Arafat called him and said, you're a great man. And reportedly, Clinton replied, Mr. Chairman, I am not a great man. I am a failure, and you have made me one. Clinton then warned George W. Bush and Colin Powell not to trust a word that Arafat would say to them. And by the way, I happen to have been in a meeting with about 30 rabbis and Bill Clinton when Hillary was running against Trump in 2016. I guess it was in 2015. And he was stumping for Hillary. But of course, he promised 45 minutes with this group of rabbis. Yeah, right. It was a 2.5-hour meeting. And when asked what was his biggest regret as president, he did not say that. And that's what we were looking for. He said, not getting involved sooner in Rwanda. Really interesting.
But there's a recent Hillary interview Bill on her podcast.
Yeah,
And he said, we were this close.
yeah,
This was after October 7th.
yeah. He still believes that. Yeah. Barack called for elections in 2001, thinking that was his best chance of getting reelected. He was not reelected. It went to Ariel Sharon, which is really interesting. Remember, Ariel Sharon was forced to leave in disgrace after the kind of allowing the IDF to secure the perimeter so that the Christian phalangists could perpetrate the massacres in Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in southern Lebanon in '82. That had serious career consequences for Ariel Sharon. But in Israel, everybody, there is. F. Scott Fitzgerald once famously said, "There are no second acts in American life." In Israel, you always have a second act. There's no such thing as political death. Okay. So very quickly, the Second Intifada is a truly awful time in Israel. There are terrible suicide bombings, each one seeming worse than the last, including one at a disco on the beach, the Dolphinarium, one at the Sbarro Pizzeria, where I and my classmates had a lot of pizza, and the infamous Pesach Seder massacre at the Park Hotel in Netanya, where a bomb blast killed 28 civilians and injured about 140 on the night of Seder. Sharon launches an operation to mop up terrorists in the West Bank, and starting in 2004, authorizes the construction of a security perimeter, a security barrier, or a separation fence, which for about less than 10% of the fence is a wall, but it's often called the apartheid wall by Israel's opponents. The intent was to keep out terrorists. The data will show that it has done an excellent job of doing that. The number of suicide bombings that have successfully been carried out by West Bank terrorists in Israel is dramatically lower than it was during the Second Intifada. So it gave Israel what Israelis sought, which was a sense that they could go on with their lives. But it also sets a stage for, I think, what we've seen for the better part of the last 20 years. So that was 20 years ago when the barrier went up. Arafat, as David pointed out, died of cancer in 2004. He was succeeded by his handpicked successor, Abu Mazen, his familiar name, Mahmoud Abbas, who was born in Tzfat, in what is today Israel, in 1935, fled during the War of Independence, went to Cairo and then the Soviet Union, and as some of you have heard, whose doctoral dissertation, written in Moscow, was effectively a treatise trafficking in Holocaust denial. Seeing that there was no path to a bilateral peace negotiation at this point, Sharon decides unilaterally to withdraw Israelis and the IDF from Gaza to secure the border, to impose a joint naval and air and land blockade administered with Egypt. That happened in 2005. Close to 9,000 Jews were forcibly removed from settlements, mostly peacefully, but with a huge anguished outcry by many on the right in Israel who felt that this was a betrayal. And again, the comparisons to Nazis were often at the forefront of Israelis who opposed the dismantling of the settlements, but it was bloodless. So I would say bloodless, but incredibly painful. 2 months later, Sharon was felled by a massive stroke that kept him in a vegetative state for the better part of a decade. His successor, Ehud Olmert, former mayor of Jerusalem, proposed handing over a majority of the territory in the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority without tackling all the other thorny issues. That day, the PA held elections, and Hamas won the popular vote by a thin margin. But due to the very weird Palestinian electoral system, which is something in which I am not an expert, and massive disunity within Fatah, which has always proved itself to be a feckless, ineffective governing organization, they captured a majority of seats in the PA parliament. Meanwhile, Hezbollah in the north continues to be a threat. Israel goes in with a much more significant incursion in 2006. That is the Second Lebanon War. By the way, every time I had visited Israel between 2006, which is when I started leading trips from WRT to Israel, I was an associate rabbi of about 3 years at the time, and I've led about 10 trips. Every time we've met with security officials in Israel, they've all said, watch the northern border. Whatever the next big war is going to be, that's where it's going to be. It is one of the things that has, in hindsight, proved to be a tactical oversight of massive proportion in a post-October 7th reality. The next year, in 2007, Hamas led a violent coup against Fatah, against the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. And we saw like PA officials being thrown off of buildings. And ever since Hamas, this is the situation up until the present day. Hamas governs in Gaza. The PA governs in the West Bank. Abbas, the leader of the PA, really viewed to be very weak, has never called for elections in the 16 years plus that he has been the head of the PA, because he knows that Hamas could easily replace him there too. And Hamas, of course, being a ruthless Islamic jihadist autocracy, has never called for elections again. So for the last 16 years, what we've really had is kind of this very ugly status quo. When Israel has at times gone into Gaza, usually in response to rocket fire from Gaza into border towns in the south, many of which were devastated on October 7th. Previously, though, had endured what we would consider the, I think, intolerable situation of life with a bunker no more than 30 seconds away on foot for every single man, woman, and child living in those communities, the majority of which, more than 200,000, maybe 300,000, are still displaced even today from their southern Israeli communities. Israel refers to these somewhat, with a little bit of a vulgar expression, mowing the lawn or mowing the grass. I printed out a separate document this morning just because I hadn't prepared extensive notes on this. It's a 25-page report of every time Israel and Gaza has clashed since 2007. I think that this is a guess. I think that when the history books are written, October 7th will be viewed as the culmination and the worst day in a 17-year Israel-Gaza war, as opposed to an isolated event. I think that Israel even now is looking at how this happened in the context of what had been going on before. And clearly the strategy of Israel, predominantly governed by Netanyahu since Hamas took power, on the position that through strength and technological development and economic development, Israel would prevail, but also largely by ignoring the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, save for when they needed to mow the grass. When things became too heated and they had to suppress or degrade the ability of the Palestinians to inflict violence and terror on Israelis living in Israel. That's been obviously that was, I think, the working premise, and many Israelis are now very angry and very disillusioned, especially as it has come to light that, among other things, some of the stability in the region was maintained and promoted by actually bolstering Hamas financially in an effort to weaken the Palestinian Authority, knowing that these two factions are very much opposed to each other. And so the condition of ongoing misery has been perpetuated not only by the Palestinians and their leadership, but there's a growing view in Israel that Israel and the government has been complicit and indeed aided and abetted the conditions that led to an October 7th, and that the Palestinians have not been in any way removed as a threat or in any way de-radicalized, but rather the opposite. So I think that's the difficulty of where we are, which is why I and many others describe October 7th as Israel's worst nightmare. It's just the worst possible thing that could have happened, because Israel is now forced into this just war of self-defense with no great outcomes, with an increasingly disturbed Israeli population, many of whom are now participating in protests not like the kind they did last year against the anti-democratic efforts of the government coalition, but rather against Netanyahu and the current unity government for, quote, insufficient efforts to bring the hostages home. So you have a growing camp of Israelis who are saying, you are focusing on prosecuting a war. You should be focusing on getting the 136 Israelis and other few internationals as well, back from Gaza. That's your only task. And if that means lessening the severity of your military response, that is what is required. That is not, in my view, the majority position, but it's a growing one 100 days into this war. Most of my information on this subject, when I'm trying to figure out what's the Israeli street, I'm talking to Reform rabbis like me who are leading communities in Israel. They will tell you, as of even this morning, their communities are strongly behind the war. And kids are signing up, they despite their parents', abject anguish and anxiety over the fate of their kids, they're saying, I'm an Israeli, this is my country, this is my home, I have to go fight. And I think a majority of Israeli parents recognize the correctness of that statement, but they also don't see a clear pathway to bring the hostages home, to end the reign of terror by Hamas, to solve the problem between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And in some ways, there are some who are, not just on the left, there are some on the center and even on the right who are saying, like Mati Friedman, great journalist, love Mati Friedman, written several books. He's basically said, we may be discovering that Hamas got everything it wanted out of this, which is a very disturbing statement for me to say. And here we are. And I don't have the answers. I'm more interested in thinking and talking with you about how things got this way. But I would be lying if I had a recommendation of where they're going. I think this is just an incredibly difficult time for our people. Let's take Patty's question.
I know we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment at all about the timing of October 7th, given that there's been so much progress toward the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
Optimism about regional peace.
So really interesting, because I was in Israel twice in 2023, once in February with a delegation of about 230 Reform rabbis from the US and around the world. And in the limited conversations we had with security professionals at the time, and in my return visit in June, July with another delegation of rabbis, everyone was talking about two things. Watch Hezbollah in the north. They've been stockpiling ballistics for years, and the next war is going to come from Lebanon. It's going to be a proxy war from Iran, which does this on the borders of countries where it wants to, assert its dominance. And the other conversation everyone was having, and watch the Saudis. Watch what the Saudis are doing, because behind the scenes, Saudi Arabia and Israel had been negotiating in closed-door conversations about normalization, about even if not officially joining the Abraham Accords, effectively recognizing the state of Israel and developing cooperation economically and militarily and tourism and all of the things to produce a very different shape of the geopolitics of the Middle East. Concerned largely about Iran. By the way, this is a strategic bet on the part of the Saudis that A, Israel isn't going anywhere. B, the world is not long going to tolerate a petro-dictatorship of the Saudi regime that does not in some way modernize. And Hamas knew all of this. Hamas had been planning this assault for a year or years. We know that now from the documents that intelligence has recovered. We also know that a big part of what Hamas was doing was waiting for its moment and perceived Israel in a position of great weakness because of its internal strife over the pro and anti-democracy, whatever you want to call it, the judicial overhaul, that Israel was in this awful place. Militarily, Israel was in the perfect place for Hamas to strike because by like a factor of 9-fold as many battalions were near the West Bank and in the north as were stationed near Gaza at the time of on October 6th. It's terribly vulnerable, and the far-right led and counter-protest movement had also led to an increase in settler versus Palestinian violence going in both directions in the West Bank. So you see this escalating situation of skirmishes, often violent, things that were like burning of mosques, burning of villages, burning of Palestinian homes, murder, reprisal murder, happening in the West Bank for months leading up to October 7th, and then Hamas strikes. So I think that the regional considerations of taking the Saudi-Israeli and the Abraham Accords, putting it on a back burner, forces Israel to reckon with the Palestinians again. Because one of the things that the Abraham Accords were designed to do, which was, I think, limit Palestinian extremism. The original Abraham Accords, you may recall a couple years ago, were signed with the promise that Israel would not annex the West Bank. It's like, we'll make peace, or we'll have mutual recognition of the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and then eventually Sudan and Morocco joined as well. In exchange for, the carrot was, and in exchange for that, Israel won't annex the West Bank, which some in the Netanyahu government had been threatening to do. Whether it was an idle threat or not, we don't know. I think some of this was a lot of talk. But I think that Hamas assessed that if Saudi Arabia and Israel make peace, like if they have an official accord, that could be game over for the Palestinian cause. Because then the Arab world would no longer take up the Palestinian cause as its rallying banner for their own solidarity, calling for the elimination of Israel. If you have the most powerful Arab state in the world recognizing Israel, that is very bad for a position that calls for the elimination of the state of Israel in the name of Palestinian liberation. Yeah, it's really tough. Okay, Jim. And anyone who has to go, you can go. You stay, you stay. I've got to show a movie in 15 minutes. If you want to stay, we're showing Crossing Delancey, a wonderful romantic comedy from 1988. It's like I have to like put a whole different hat on. Yeah. Shh. Yeah. Hang on. I want to hear the question. What was with the hostages? I'm not following. Oh, well, fortunately, I don't know the answer to that question. We've seen since 2005 a willingness of Palestinian militants to engage in kidnapping in order to advance their strategic objectives. If you are a Palestinian, you would reasonably have concluded that kidnapping works, right? I think that how many Palestinians were returned for Gilad Shalit? Like 1,000? Over 1,027 is the number that sticks in my head. So how many Palestinians might you get for? I think that in the extreme, the extreme Palestinian position is kidnapping works, and 136 hostages should be worth every last Palestinian remaining in an Israeli prison, which could be 25 or 30,000 people. Yeah, was one of the architects. Yeah. Yahya Sinwar. Yep. Let's take Ken. Yeah. Yeah. Shh.
Do you foresee some probability, and what would that number be, of Jews living in peace at some point where they don't have to worry about rockets being fired upon them from some direction?
Do I see a possibility? So here's something that I've come to believe over the years, that there is a difference between hope and optimism. The answer to your question is I am not optimistic. And yet, I believe that hope is not actually a belief, it's a religious mandate. It is an approach to living that is actually in the category of mitzvah. Like, it's part of the way in which the Jewish psyche is shaped by our age-old tradition to orient ourselves to the project of living in a difficult world. So I believe that hope is a thing we must do, not necessarily feel. Like, we have to live in such a way as if this possibility could be real. I'm not really optimistic about this happening anytime soon. I do think that I've been thinking a lot about, well, what are the minimum conditions that Israel will accept to terminate the military offensive in Gaza? What are the objectives it needs to accomplish? Of course, the stated objectives on October 8th were the absolute elimination of Hamas, and it must never rule Gaza again. there are signs that the hardness of that position is starting to degrade and fracture. We all see that. Even the message of Blinken at Biden's behest, and Israel has had no better ally than Joe Biden. Say what you will. Joe Biden has a very difficult job too, because he's not only, thinking about our allyship with Israel, he's thinking about the world. It is getting harder and harder for the U.S. to give Israel carte blanche to prosecute this war any way that Netanyahu wants. But Blinken and Biden are also reading the tea leaves of the Israeli street. And it is true that in the last few weeks, discontent with the situation of the hostages is becoming a more pronounced narrative in Israeli society. Not to the point where you have Israelis demonstrating the way they are in London and New York and college campuses, free Gaza. That's not what's happening. But you do have a growing movement of tens of thousands of Israelis who are showing up regularly to say, bring them home, even if it means a different approach to the war. So Israel has these two terrible objectives, terrible in the sense that they're necessary and there's no clear agreement on what it means to achieve them and how it will achieve them. How exactly will Israel bring the hostages home when, I think it was very helpful for Steve, who was sitting over there, to say, what's in it for the Palestinians? Right? What's in it for Hamas? Hamas thus far has at least a few things about which it can declare that its objectives were successful, in that it raised awareness of what they would describe as the plight of the Palestinians. It moved sympathy to the Palestinian cause and away from Israel. It has further, again, these are all things that are being said by Hamas leadership, I believe, and by their supporters. It has made Israel look bad. It has also shown that the Zionists are not invulnerable, militarily or politically. And it has actually advanced, this is the thing that American audiences aren't really talking a lot about, but it's very big for the leaders of Hamas. It has weakened the Palestinian Authority and strengthened Hamas, right? So no one's talking about what is Mahmoud Abbas going to do next, except the Americans who are like, well, he's the guy who has to run the government when all of this is over. But we're not close to decapitating the leadership of Hamas. I mean, we had that assassination in Lebanon, which Israel is not taking credit for. We had, some significant military objectives being achieved in Gaza. We've seen that Israel may be changing its strategy from, what somebody I know calls dumb bombs to smarter bombs, less killing that is indiscriminate and using a more discriminatory approach. But of course, the problem with that is Israeli parents know what it means. It means that their children are doing hand-to-hand combat in tunnels and more Israeli soldiers will die. And that's not a position that Israel can or will take lightly, because now it's its own people who are more vulnerable. So I don't think Israel has any great options. Netanyahu has made it clear that they're staying the course, and that even a longer, ceasefire, other than a few hours a day for humanitarian relief, is totally off the table, because it only gives Hamas what they want. And there's also no evidence that the majority of humanitarian assistance that's actually going into Gaza is actually reaching the people who need it because of Hamas, not because of the IDF. So I see a lot of bad, actually. I don't see a lot that's good here. You had a hand up before.
Yeah, it was brought up how it's not just this radical Islam against Israel in Hamas, but it's radical. I mean, isn't Israel just the canary in the coal mine?
Of course it is.
Radical Islam against Western Israel?
It is, and the proof of that came about 3 days ago in Iran.
1.3 billion Arabs or
Muslims.
Muslims. By multiple Western nation intelligence estimates, 80% of them are peaceful, loving, or
Sure.
somewhat similar.
Right.
And 20% are these radicals that want Sharia law across the world.
Right. Yeah.
So that's 300 million. That's more than the U.S. population. And we see what's happening in Europe.
Yeah, there's a podcast that I listened to in the very few days following October 7th that I thought was absolutely brilliant. It's by Sam Harris, who's a philosopher and noted atheist, actually, but he talks about the danger of jihadism, of violent Islamic religious doctrine, and its role in perpetuating terror, most of which is committed against Muslims. And so this is the crazy thing. Somehow the world's attention is still on Gaza and not on the 80 Iranians who were murdered in cold blood by ISIS bombings just 3 days ago. Like, all the people who are posting on Instagram and standing with scores, they seem not to care about the 80 Iranians who were all like just normal people going about their lives who were murdered in cold blood by ISIS. Because most violent jihadist terrorism is actually not happening against Jewish or Western targets. If you want to have a really disturbing Sunday night, go online, and I think it's on Amazon Prime, go and rent Hotel Mumbai. But I'm warning you, Hotel Mumbai. Yeah, Hotel Mumbai. It's about the 2008 jihadist assault on the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. Dev Patel is in it. It's a great movie, but I found it very hard to watch. It's a very disturbing, very violent film. But in a way, Sam Harris recommended it in this podcast. He said, if you want to understand what violent Islamic jihad looks like, that movie is a pretty good window into it. Most of the targets, the vast majority of targets of extreme jihadist Islam are other Muslims whom they believe are heretics. And they do so, they train their fighters from a very young age, and they brainwash them to believe that paradise awaits if they martyr themselves for the liberation of the caliphate or Palestine or whatever. And so that's the whole thing. And so Hamas has done a very good job of cultivating a military wing of tens of thousands of soldiers who are effectively, forgive me, I'm not using this term in a way that is intended to be disparaging, but basically they're jihadi drones or zombies. They've been brainwashed from childhood, from early childhood. Like, they discovered in Gaza a number of practice tunnels, okay, for kids. And they send kids, not all kids, but I'm sure they look for the ripest targets, right? They're looking for kids who come from situations where life is so miserable, life is already, they can easily make the case that your life here on earth is valueless. The real life is the one that awaits you after you become a, shaheed, after you become a martyr for Islam. And the pathway to get there is to murder as many, fill in the blank here, Jews, Westerners, fake Muslims, heretical Muslims, like the targets of the luxury hotel Mumbai, the Taj Hotel in Mumbai. That's your path. And that's why you have these recordings that Hamas terrorists from October 7th actually filmed themselves, put on their social media, sent to their victims' families, and sent home. Like, one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard was a shaheed, one of these fighters, phoning his parents and saying, "Mom, Dad, get on the phone. I just murdered 10 Jews. Your son's a hero. Your son is, it's victory. This is everything you want." And you hear them saying, "Allahu Akbar," like God is great. And you can almost hear in the parents' voices, I'm speculating here, is this really what we wanted our boy to grow up to be? But they found like this training camp for little kids, like to learn how to be a Hamas fighter. So what has to happen when the war is over? The people whose opinions I value have likened this to the need for the re-education of Nazi Germany after the war. The need for it. I don't think anyone has a plan for it. And how much will Israel be involved in that? How much does Israel want to be involved in that? Israel has very mixed feelings, and that's an understatement, about reoccupying Gaza. But Israel has no idea whom it can trust to govern in Gaza, or the West Bank for that matter. That's why I say, so yeah, I'm not an optimist. But for me, hope is a religious doctrine, and I continue to believe that sometimes things emerge when they are least expected that provide a way where there was no way. And the story of Israel is one such story, by the way. Like, if I had not been a person of hope living in 1870 can you imagine? But I don't know. The project of a Zionist state, 75 years in, it has correctly been assessed at the most critical time in Israel's history since the founding of the state. We're living through Jewish history, and I'll conclude, and then I'll take Michelle's comment, and then I have to go show him a fun movie. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to hear Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, a brilliant public intellectual, and the director of the Hartman Center, which is just, if you want like good content, either email me and I'll send you some links, or we can create a WhatsApp group. I've been doing that a lot, which is a great way. And we can just share, hey, what do you think of this article? But I also recommend go to the website of the Hartman Institute. Just look it up, Hartman. They do amazing work, I think, in Israel, and they continue to find reasons to be a person of hope. He spoke about 3-4 weeks ago at a home in Scarsdale, and he said, we do not, as Jews, get to choose the moment of history that we live through. We always get to choose how we will respond. Exactly. Yeah, and Gandalf got it from Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychotherapist who was interred in Auschwitz, and who basically said the Nazis could take everything away from us, but they could not take away our freedom to choose how we would respond. Right? So that it comes from within. And what will we make of this moment? That is very much on the table for the Jewish people, the world, the Jewish state.